This is the fourth presentation on the book of Genesis, and we're dealing in this section with purposes and themes and the storyline of the Joseph story. First of all, the Joseph story shows several themes in it. It shows the choice of the younger son that is common in the Old Testament, that the child that one would not expect is the one that's chosen and that receives glory. One of the important themes in the Joseph story is the theme of dreams and dreaming. Visions and dreams that Joseph and Pharaoh have serve as prophetic predictions of God's activity through Joseph, through the family of Jacob, and through their sojourn in Egypt. They also demonstrate God's divine oversight of history. Yet another theme is that of recognize or recognition. Several words in the Hebrew language, which mean recognize or recognition or not recognized or non-recognition, occur in the Joseph story. The point is, no one seems to recognize what's going on until we reach the end of the story. The brothers don't recognize who Joseph is, really. The father, Isaac, thinks that, or rather Jacob, thinks that his son is dead, but actually is not. And he seems like he recognizes his son's cloak, but does not. In Egypt, Joseph is one who is not recognized, that is, a foreigner. We, the reader, don't know for sure how the story will end. We don't recognize God's hand through the flow of history till we reach the end of the story. But the most important theme in the Joseph story occurs twice in the story. Genesis 37 through 50, and that is a quote that Joseph tells his brothers. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, that many may be preserved alive as today, he says. God's preservation of Israel, of Canaan, and even Egypt are the most important theme in the Joseph story, though the term preserve or preservation only occurs twice in the narrative. If promise is the main theme of the Abraham story, or the promises to Abraham, and if blessing is the main theme in the Jacob story, preservation of his covenant people is the main theme in the Joseph story. Let's begin summarizing the accounts in chapters 37 through 50. Chapter 37. Joseph is portrayed not as a wonderful kid, but as insufferable. First, he's a tattletale. He tells his mom and dad a bad report about his brothers. He is Dad's favorite, and so his parents make him a coat of long sleeves or many colors. It's difficult to know exactly what is intended by the words in the Hebrew. But he gets special treatment the brothers don't get. Joseph then dreams a couple of dreams, and the brothers and his parents take exception to them because the dreams seem to indicate that all of his brothers and his parents will bow down to him. The first dream is about a number of stalks of wheat, shocks of grain, and each one of them has a shock of grain, and all the shocks of grain bow down to Joseph's shock. The next dream deals with the sun and moon and 12 stars, and they all bow down to Joseph's star. Even Jacob takes exception to this dream and thinks it is over the top. All through the Joseph story, there are motifs of grain and famine and buying and selling. Grain and its lack, famine drives many people to Egypt throughout history during periods of famine. When the brothers are very upset and jealous about their brother, one day Jacob sends Joseph to inquire after the brothers who are tending their father's flocks. Joseph gets lost along the way and can't find them. A man finds him and tells him where the brothers are. He goes, and the brothers determine at Judah's instigation that Judah wants to kill him and then end his bragging and his favoritism. Reuben intends to save his brother. Reuben is the oldest. And so Reuben suggests that they throw him in a pit. So they do. They throw him in a dry cistern. And then Reuben intends to come back and release him later. When Reuben is not there, the other brothers decide, when they see a camel caravan of Midianites or Ishmaelites, to sell him as a slave to Egypt. And so they do. They need to come up with some good reason why all of this has happened, why Joseph doesn't come back with them when they go home. And so they take his coat that they've stripped off of him and they rub it with animal blood and take it to their father, Jacob, who thinks he recognizes it's his son's cloak and that his son is dead. Joseph ends up in Egypt as a slave in a man named Potiphar's household. Chapter 38 deals with the story of Judah and Tamar. So the story of Joseph is interrupted. Judah has 3 sons. The eldest is married to a woman named Tamar. We're told that he was killed. Then the second son refused to do the custom of levirate marriage, that is, the brother-in-law taking the dead brother's wife to raise up a child for the dead brother. So the Lord slew him. Judah only has 1 son left, and he refuses to give that son to Tamar. In the meantime, Tamar then dresses like a prostitute, goes and sits in the crossroads and waits for Judah to come by. Judah comes by, sees the prostitute. He doesn't realize it's his own daughter-in-law, and asks if they can spend time together. She says, "Sure, but what do you have to give me?" He says, "Well, I don't have anything to pay you, but here's my staff and my signet ring." And so she takes those. They have sex. She becomes pregnant. Sometime later, The townspeople tell Judah, "Your daughter-in-law has played the whore. She's pregnant." Judah comes to exact punishment on her, and she says, "Fine, that's fine with me, but first tell me who owns these things," and that is the staff and the ring. Then Judah realizes that it's his daughter, that she was the one that played the harlot, that acted as if she was a prostitute, that he says he was more guilty than she was at refusing to do the custom of levirate marriage. But in any event, the line of David is continued. Judah was the deep ancestor of King David. Chapters 39 through 41 deal with Joseph's declining fortunes in Egypt and his eventual rise to power. While Joseph is in Potiphar's house as a slave, God blesses Potiphar's house, and Potiphar realizes it's because of Joseph that he does so well. But Potiphar's wife takes a shine to Joseph and repeatedly tries to seduce him. Eventually, she lays hands on him and says, "Lie down with me." He refuses, runs out of the house, leaves his garment in her hand, and then she accuses him of trying to rape her. Potiphar then throws him in prison. That's a 14th century painting of Joseph accused by Potiphar's wife. While in prison, God blesses the prison because of Joseph's presence. And the jailer recognizes he can leave everything he wants in Joseph's hands because it will be done well, and he will be blessed, and the prison will be blessed. While in prison, the royal baker and the royal cupbearer or butler have dreams. And in fact, they each have a dream, as Joseph had had 2 dreams earlier. They're disturbed by the dreams, and they tell Joseph. The cupbearer or baker or butler has a dream that turns out to come true. When Joseph gives a favorable interpretation of the cupbearer's dream, which is that Pharaoh would take a cup from his hands and would drink from it. When the baker saw that there was a favorable interpretation, the baker also told his dream, thinking maybe there would be a favorable interpretation, and that is someone with a basket of bread on top of their head, and the birds came and ate the bread from the basket, and there was not a favorable interpretation of that. He says, within 3 days, your head will be taken from your body. And in fact, the cupbearer is restored to Pharaoh's, being Pharaoh's cupbearer, and the baker is then executed and his head is removed. Joseph asked the baker, or the butler rather, if he would remember him to Pharaoh when he went to Pharaoh's household, that nothing he had done was deserving of being in jail. The cupbearer forgot, and 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream. And in Pharaoh had 2 dreams. One was of thin and or thick, beautiful, sleek cows that came up out of the Nile and ate from the banks of the Nile. The next dream was then 7 emaciated cows came up out of the Nile and consumed the 7 fat cows. The next dream was of grains, stalks of grain, 7 lush, beautiful stalks of grain. Then 7 emaciated stalks came and ate up the fat, plump ones. No one can interpret the dreams for Pharaoh, but finally the cupbearer said, I know a guy who interprets dreams. And so they bring him from prison, and of course, Joseph interprets the dreams for Pharaoh and mentions 7 fat years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And so Joseph gives counsel that what Pharaoh ought to do is appoint someone to be over the country and store up during the 7 fat years for the 7 lean years that would follow. Pharaoh appoints Joseph to be his second in command to do that. This is Joseph interpreting the dreams, a grain silo in Egypt. This is Joseph, a painting of Joseph being over the granaries of Pharaoh. So Joseph does that and became the manager of all of the grain distribution in the land of Egypt. And in fact, Joseph, in essence, becomes an Egyptian, changes his name to Zaphanat-Paneah, and marries a priest's daughter named Asenat. He has 2 children by her, the first named Manasseh and the second Ephraim, that are born to him in Egypt. Chapters 42 through 44 deal with Joseph and his brothers. The famine is severe not only in Egypt but in the land of Canaan, and Jacob sends the brothers to go to Egypt to buy grain. When they arrive there, we're told Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. Joseph accused them of spying and wants to know who they are and why they're there. And they mentioned that there were 11 brothers and one is no more because they realize they've sold him into slavery. They bow before him, and his earlier dream, a dream of his brothers bowing before him, literally comes true. He sends them back to bring back the younger brother, Benjamin, who's still at home. And they say, you will not see my face again unless you bring back the younger brother. They do bring back the younger brother. But first, Joseph puts all the money of their grain back in each of their sacks, and they don't understand it on their way home. They find their grain with their money in the sacks. Eventually, they talk Jacob into allowing Benjamin to come back with them. Jacob is reluctant to do so. They go back to Egypt, and Joseph gives a great deal of attention to Benjamin, gives him more food. And then, as they are going back home with more grain, Joseph's servant comes and finds them in the way, says that they've stolen from his master. They open the sacks of grain and finds Joseph's divination cup in Benjamin's sack, which Joseph had placed there. He brings them back. He threatens to put Benjamin into slavery. Judah confesses that he's the one that ought to go into slavery. It was retribution for what they had done to Joseph many years before. It is only then that Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. His brothers feared for their lives, and Joseph said, "You intended it for evil, but God intended it for good, that he might preserve many alive." Chapters 45 through 50 deal with the migration of all of Jacob's family into Egypt, into that green part you see there in the on the right side of the green part of the Nile Delta, the land of Goshen, a very, very fertile area. Chapters 46 through 47, the family of Jacob settles in Egypt. Chapters 48 through 49, Jacob blesses his sons and grandsons. And finally, the death of Jacob in Egypt. The brothers once again thought that he would kill them once their father was dead. Joseph reiterated, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." Joseph himself finally died and left instructions for his bones to be taken back to Canaan when in the future they returned to the land of Canaan.